Hi, my friend. In this video, we're going to be making a UKG song inspired by Sammy Virgi's track, If You Need It. And we're going to find out if we can do this in under 7 days, completely mixing, mastering it, as well as arranging it in that 7-day period. So right now we are looking at the actual Ableton project file, looking at the song that we'll be making. So you can see in this project, we have Sammy Virgi's track, If You Need It, actually in here. And as we're building it out, the trick is to really flick between the reference track back and forth so that you can select the right sounds, you can set the volumes in the right levels, and that's really going to get you 80% of the way there. So all in all, this tune took me, it was under 7 days, but it took me a little longer than normal. It was about 6 hours to recreate the drums, the bass, the synths, as well as the vocal, which I turned off. I'll just give you a little preview. So you can see it was inspired by the VIRJI track, If You Need It, but then I decided to try to check it in a slightly different way and make it a Paper Planes by MIA edit. So we're going over all of that individually in this video. And if finishing songs faster, you want to be able to do a new song within a week or a couple days or a couple hours as well, I made you a free bundle of templates, samples, and special bonuses that I use each week to help me be able to finish one song per week. So just visit the link in the description and you can grab the ultimate song finishing toolkit completely for free. And with that said, let's make this. All right. So now that we're back here in Ableton, let's build up these drums. So what we're listening to right here is the drums that I recreated. And what I did, one thing I want to show you right away is we have the song Sammy Virgi, If You Need It, in this project file. And what I did was went over to the key section over here and I mapped the solo button to the S key so that I could flick between it. So right now we're listening to the original song by Sammy Virgi. If I press S, now we're listening to what I recreated. So setting it up like that, it's a good way to build against the reference track. So what I want to do is I'm going to go through each element one by one here, just to give you an idea of how I built it in the exact order that I built it. So right now we're just listening to the drums and we'll start things off with the kick. So let me just solo that out here. So the kick, there are two tracks going on right here. One is the kick high and the kick low. So for basically what I did is I have the higher end, the kind of the mids and the highs is actually the kick that I sampled directly from Sammy Virgi's track. And the low is a sample that I found in my library to kind of add a little bit more beef to it. So what I did to sample Sammy Virgi's kick is I have this track here called Reference Kick. And all I did, as you can see here, I found a spot in the track where the kick was playing and the kick wasn't like high pass, so it's a full sounding kick, and then put it on its own layer. Then what I did was I had this weird little transient shaping kind of Ableton rack here. And so what this did was by putting it on its own track and then adding in this kind of little kick extractor group that I created, it automatically separates that kick into a high, medium, and low. So then what I'm able to do is then adjust the transient, like the sustain of what's going on in the high end, adjust the high EQ, and do that for the mid and the low as well to kind of shape things out and try to take out the kick as much as possible, make sure there's no hi-hats or anything like that. And then what I simply did after that was selected a kick drum from my own sample library to add in some beef, as it were. So if I just solo up the high end here, this is taken from the Sammy Virgi track. And then if I add the low end, it adds a bit of beef. And so what I did here is this one here is just playing the frozen kick sample from the track. And then over here, what I did was I set the in to, instead of having it so that the MIDI is actually playing, the in is coming from the high kick. So that way the MIDI just follows it. So I actually don't have to have the MIDI duplicated here. Then here, just selected a kick from my sample library, made it so it's only the low end by using the multiband dynamics. And altogether we have a full sounding kick drum. So moving on, I believe the next thing that I did add was these claps. let's take a look at this. So there, in terms of the MIDI, this is what the MIDI looks like here. And I feel like the snares is quite a bit where that kind of UKG kind of like sound really comes from. So here's a look at the MIDI. There are a couple of different clap samples being played here. In terms of the processing, there's really nothing else going on here. So let's take a look at the pattern. Can't really explain it. I'm not a music theory master or anything like that, but hopefully you can kind of get an idea here. And then what I did do is I would flick between this and the reference track to choose the samples, as well as to select the volumes, because the volumes and the sample selection is really that 80-20 rule there. 80% that 20% choosing the volumes and choosing the samples is going to get you to 80% of the result. Next up, I added in the snares. So if we have a look, we have kind of that standard every 2 and 4. We have the main hit coming in, and you can see here I actually froze, like I sampled out a snare sound from the Sammy Virgi sound as well. So basically, we look back over at the reference track. What you can do is usually if you find the extended version, you can find there's usually a drum intro and drum outro, and from there that's going to be where you can definitely find like a kick and snares and even hi-hats that are more or less isolated for you to actually sample out from the track and then use into your own. So let's have a look at the MIDI. So for the most part, it's those standard snare hits, but then you have that kind of UKG, like on those like off beats, adding that interesting flair. In terms of the processing, again, there's really nothing going on here. It's mostly just sample selection and volume. And then next up, I added in these hi-hats. So here we have, the main thing is I did again extract a Sammy Virgi hi-hat from the track. Again, went to the reference track, found a spot where the hi-hat was kind of isolated, EQ'd out, maybe out some of the low end, that kind of stuff. Nothing too crazy, but mostly just stole it, and then added in a little extra hi-hat there for a little bit of flavor. In terms of the processing, again, there's really nothing much going on here. And then last but not least, what I did was I added in 2 different top loops. So I'll share what that sounded like. What we have is this one here. So if we take a look at it, nothing too crazy going on. What I did do is in the warp mode under transient, if you change it to this one where the right facing area is, you can adjust the envelope and it'll kind of tighten it up a little bit. So it could help blend it into your drum loop a little bit and add a lot more character. In terms of the processing on this first top loop, we're just getting rid of a bunch of the lows to make room for the kick drum that we have selected, so that really cuts through. There's a bit of one knob side chain and a bit of one knob saturation. The side chain is to make room for the kick drum and the bass, and the saturation is to bring out a bit of the vibe and a bit of the character by adding in some harmonics. Kind of fills up the sound a bit, and as well as adding in width with a one knob width plugin. If you want a little bit more of information on how to build out your own kind of channel strip like this and how I built it and why I make these moves, definitely let me know and I can make a dedicated video to that. I want to keep things rolled in here. Then we have this additional kind of tops loop that's been added in here. Very, very low in the mix here. So if we just solo it out, it's almost barely doing anything. I could probably remove this. I would say it's maybe adding some kind of vibe, but not really. Yeah, so that's a look at the drums. Pretty basic. Main thing that I think I would like you to take away from this is as I was building it, so I have this S key, so I would be pressing this S key like this, and then flicking to mine, and then pressing it again to flick back to the reference. You can hear it's very identical because it is using some like sampled sounds, but even the sounds that I selected, trying to flick back and forth so that you can find sounds that are similar, and setting the volumes right is really the main thing. That's really what I'd like you to take away from this one, and that way is how you can finish these drums super duper quickly. All right. So what I've done is I've soloed out the drums and the bass so that we can focus on the bass while listening to it in context with the rest of the drums. I think it's always important when you're building your tracks to be listening to it, not in isolation. You want to make sure that things are working together to create the finished track in totality, as opposed to just making a bass sound good by itself. You want to make sure everything's working together. You're finishing songs, not just creating a bass line. In addition to that, I do also want to point out that right here, you can see that we have Sammy Virgi's track, If You Need It, actually in the project file as well. And this is super important because what you can then do is map the solo key to, say, the S key on your keyboard. So you can flick between the reference track back and forth so that you can do a couple things. One is you want to be selecting the right notes while following the reference track. So flicking back and forth, you can make sure that you're setting the right notes. Second is that you can choose the right sound so that it's sounding as similar as possible by flicking back and forth. You can make sure that it's sounding similar to the reference. And then third, a really big mixing tip here is you want to set the volumes to that reference track as closely as possible, because setting volumes and selecting the right sound is really that kind of 80%. It's like the 80-20 rule. So 20%, it's nothing too crazy. You're not doing any crazy sound design stuff, volume and sound selection, but it's going to get you 80% there. And it's going to be the fastest way to really get a professional and awesome sounding sound, as opposed to just winging it and hoping that you're just going to get things right. So with that said, let's take a look at the bass. This bass track has two layers. There's a sub layer and a mid bass layer for the character. In terms of the MIDI, before we get into the sound design a little bit more closely, I'm going to just give you a quick look at what it looks like. So what it kind of is like that offbeat polyrhythmic kind of sound that resets after every 2 bars. I'll just kind of show you the MIDI so that you can kind of copy it. I can't fully explain what's going on. I'm not a music theory kind of producer. I'm a lot more sample based and vibe based. So if that works with you, then we're on the same boat here. But this is a look at the MIDI. It's kind of changing the note a little bit. So there's a little bit of a chord progression, kind of vibing things out a little bit here. In terms of the sound design, like I mentioned, there are 2 layers. So first off is the sub. So yeah, let me just mute the bass guitar layer. So this is what the sub sounds like on its own. And the reason I usually like to do this in 2 different tracks like this is 2 reasons. One, I find that starting things off with a sub bass sound, like basically just a sine wave, it's a super awesome way to, very similar as if you were using like a traditional piano or a guitar to start off with chord progression and melody. Since it's almost the most like natural tone, there's not a lot of crazy sound design, you can really focus on getting the right notes down correctly first, and then playing with sound design and getting like the texture right by adding in the mid bass layer later. In addition to that, I also find it's a nice way to control the mix, because you can have the sub that's really focusing on the low end completely, and then when you add in the mid layer, that's where you're adding in the character. So one is really just focusing on the low end and the fullness, and the other one is adding in that character. So I'm going to add that back in. And taking a look at the sound design here. So for the subs, what I have is this little V sub kind of preset that I made. It might be included in that little freebie that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Basically, it's more or less just a sine wave with some options to add in a little bit of drive. And the main reason for adding in some of the drive here is to help it cut through the mix a little bit more and add a bit more character. Nothing too crazy going on there. It's mostly just a simple sine wave. So if I open it up, it's just using operator, and it's more or less just a simple sine wave with a little bit of some sauce going on there. Nothing crazy. What's more interesting, I think, is this setup with the dual tracks. So you might notice here that the MIDI is playing on the sub track, but the MIDI is not playing on the mid bass track. And how I've set that up is that instead of dropping the MIDI on this track, what you can do is, if instead of all ins, as you can see here on the sub track, when you click that, you can select the sub track that you have, and this one is called subs. And then if you flick it, instead of off or auto, if you set it to in, it will then play the MIDI for you in your output. So what's happening here is, instead of it playing the MIDI on the track, it's actually then grabbing the MIDI from whatever you've selected. So this way you don't have to be duplicating over the MIDI tracks. If you make a change to the MIDI here, it'll automatically change it on the mid bass here. So it's just a lot more efficient and a lot less room for errors. It's super fast. It's a faster way to work, and I think it's a little bit more clever. And that's what I usually do, and I'd recommend as well. So with that said, then you don't have to worry about the notes. You can just worry about the sound design, since the MIDI is automatically coming in. In terms of the sound design, what I chose is a bass guitar sample. In my music, that's kind of a bit more my signature sound, using bass guitar. It's what I prefer. I like the sound of it. You can use anything you like in your mid bass. You can change it from song to song, or you can try to find something similar where maybe it's a synth that you like the mid bass character of it, and that's your kind of signature sound, your go-to. In terms of what I've done here is usually what I'd recommend doing with this method is adding in the MIDI pitch device. So in case the MIDI is sounding like perfect for the sub, but when it's routing into your mid bass, it's sounding too low or too high, you can easily move it up 12 semitones or down 12 semitones if you need to. Then right here, it's going into my sound of choice. It's actually a sample from the Omnisphere Trillion that I really like. What I did was sampled it out and dropped it into an Ableton sampler. This way it's going to have less of a CPU load, and this has some of the fun Ableton stuff you can have in here. So I do have the drive, the SMP circuit. I like bringing that up a little bit for that kind of distorted bass guitar character. When working with a sub and mid bass separate tracks, what you'll want to do is on the mid bass track is remove a bunch of the lows. So we have an EQ8 here at the 200 hertz mark, dropping out a bunch of the lows, so that way it's not overlapping and getting all muddy and crappy sounding. This way the subs is carrying all the weight and really taking care of the low end in a pure sine wave, beautiful way. And then you make room on the mid bass, so it's just adding in the character on the upper area there. Then what we have next is I have this one knob width plugin, just kind of taking it away from the middle and pushing that mid bass to the sides a bit. So it's making everything sound a bit fuller, and it's also making room in the middle for that sub to shine through. We have a bit of one knob side chain going on here, just going against the kick drum. So that way it is bouncing away, just ducking away from the kick drum so the kick comes through. And it does add a little bit of that bounce as well. Then we do have some one knob side chain, adding in a bit of fullness to the sound. And then I also have this transient designer, just getting rid of some of the sustain so it tightens it up a little bit. If you would like, let me know in the comments below if you want me to explain this whole kind of custom channel strip, how I built it, and kind of the decision making that goes into each thing here, a little bit more detail. I can make a custom video for it, but it's a pretty interesting way to have this load up on every single track, so you can make the very simple mix as you go decisions as you're going along with some simple one knobs, so you're also using your ears more than the visuals. But with that said, that is a look at this track. There's nothing else to really mention in terms of the arrangement. We'll go over that in a future video, but more or less the bass is playing what it's playing here throughout the whole thing. So yeah, there we go. All right. So what we're looking at and listening at is the project file, and what we're going to be focusing on is these kind of synth sounds here. So I'll just solo those out for you. So we'll also be going into the vocals as well. I'm going to leave that a bit more to the end, just because it's going to kind of, having two vocals, me talking, and that going on at the same time can get a little bit annoying and sound like crap. So we'll focus on things also in the order in which I built them, so that you can get a good idea of how this happened as well. So what I'm going to do to just kind of get things started is I'm going to turn everything off. So what we're listening to is mostly the bass, the drums, and some of the little effects actually as well. I'll turn that off because we'll go over the effects in the arrangement video that we'll be doing next. So first off is this kind of organ sound. So this is more or less, we'll take a look at the MIDI. I'll zoom in. I can't fully explain it. I'm not a music theory master. But this is what it looks like if you want to kind of recreate it yourself. Try to make the project file available too as well. If that'd be interesting, let me know in the comments below. But this is a look at the MIDI. It's more or less following the sound of the bass line. So if we take a look now at the sound design, what I decided to go with is this kind of house organ sound. And I just found this kind of house organ on Splice, dropped it in here, and that's what we're using for the sound as opposed to recreating anything with synthesizers and stuff. Not a big fan of that. In terms of the processing here on this one, main thing is this EQ8. We are removing a bunch of lows to make room for the kick and the bass. We have the side chain just cranked, the one knob side chain, as well as some drive, some saturation, kind of filling out the sound a bit more and adding a bit of character. And if you'd also like a video on this whole setup here, it's a kind of a channel strip that I add to everything, custom channel strip. Let me know. I can teach you how I built this out, a little bit more of the thought process behind it. Something I should mention as well that I definitely want to point your attention to is as building this out, I'm actually listening back and forth to Sammy Virgi's track if you need it. So I've actually dropped that track, as you can see here, into the project file as well. And then turn it off and use the key mapping function to have it so the S key on my keyboard will solo out this track. And why that's important is because that way what you can do is you can flick between the reference track and what you're building to set the right notes, also do the right choose your samples and your sound design to the actual reference. And really big tip here is to set the volumes to what you're hearing in the actual reference track. It's a really good tip to get kind of that 80% mark without 20% of the effort. Pareto's principle, if you're familiar with it. That's really going to get everything sounding a lot more professional and tighter and all that in a really effortless way. So definitely would recommend that. So with that said, let's keep adding in these additional tracks. So what I added in next, I believe, was actually this thing here. So we have an additional sound. And so what's going on here is, so this one is playing E sharp as the main note. If we look back at the other one, it's also playing E sharp. So I thought it was some kind of harmonic. It sounded like a harmony to me, but I could be wrong. We have this additional sound. It's actually the same house organ sound. Maybe what it is actually E sharp 2, and we have E sharp 2. Okay, so basically it's the same sound, but also moved over to the right. Oh, here we go. Okay, I knew something was funny there. So what was going on here is it's been transposed up 10 semitones, and that's why, even though it's the same sound, it has like a kind of a harmony sound, a little bit of a higher, different kind of texture, and it's going to add some interesting energy and a cool bounce to it. Other than that, so it is the same sound, slightly different MIDI. If I show the MIDI, just a little bit less is happening when you compare it to the other one. Mostly pedaling on that E sharp, and it is all being transposed up 10 semitones to add a kind of a harmony sound to it. In terms of the processing, it's very similar to the first track. We're removing a bunch of the lows to make room for the kick and the sub, shelving out a bit of the highs. And then we have this transient designer where we are reducing the sustain a little bit to kind of tighten up the sound a little bit. We have the one knob sidechain, bouncing it off the kick, making room for the kick. And then a bunch of one knob saturation to kind of fill out the sound a bit. And next up is this kind of weird texture. And so what this is doing is it's kind of playing off, I guess it's going from the G sharp to the E sharp, and it's also doing a similar kind of like polyrhythmic kind of, it's not just on the ones and the twos and threes, it's like a kind of on the offbeats, and it's adding an interesting kind of vibe, very similar to the Bassline. In terms of the processing, I was using a synth called Synth, and I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it, but it has this thing called Genopatch, where you're able to drop a sound from any audio file into it, and it'll then use AI to start recreating it. So instead of having to do all the sound design yourself, you can find a sound that you're interested in, drop it in here, and it'll use AI to recreate it. That's an interesting thing. I think I grabbed a sound from the actual, something from apart from the Sammy Virgi track, and just dropped it in there where there was kind of a synth on its own. In terms of the processing, other than that, we're using the Sound Choice Pan Man. I think it's on the a bit wider setting or something like that. It's basically just moving that sound from the left and the right a little bit, keeping it out of the middle and adding in a little bit of kind of like flair to things. Then we are removing a bunch of the lows to make room for the kick and the sub and all that kind of stuff. Then we do have an auto filter on. It's getting rid of a bunch of the highs, and then at certain points of the song, it's filtering it in and out for kind of a arrangement kind of vibe, which will go into the arrangement in a future video. Then we have this Tantra preset going on it, this Aurora sound, which is kind of adding in some of this texture. If I bring it up all the way, that's what it sounds like. A little bit too shrill and intense, so I just dialed it back to the mix. to add some interesting texture and sounds to it. And then other than that, we have some one knob sidechain, bouncing off the kick, and then a little bit of drive, adding in some fullness to that track. Then what we have next is this sound right. And so this is just pedaling on the root of the tune here, E sharp. And what's going on here is we're using Synth again. So you can see here, I cut out a piece of the Sammy Virgi track if you need it, and dropped it into the Geno patch. And then what I did was I automated the release as well as the effect to kind of get that swelling sound that you can kind of hear there, which is what I definitely heard a lot in the original tune. It's definitely using like an actual synth for all this, but again, I'm not a big fan of that, using traditional sound design. So grabbed a sound from the Sammy Virgi track, dropped it into here, and started playing with the release and the kind of weird effect that's going on in Synth to create that swelling. In addition to that, I'm running this through a spectral resonator, and what this is kind of cool is what you can do is you can set the mode to MIDI, and similar to how we did in the bass video earlier this week or last week or whenever it may have dropped, we're having the MIDI from the subs, so the bass is actually kind of forcing this synth sound into the notes from the bass sound. So this way things are a little bit more in key, forcing it in, which is cool, particularly with the synth kind of AI sounds. The AI sounds can sometimes be kind of atonal and sound kind of funky, and by adding a spectral resonator after tracking the MIDI from your bass, you can make sure things are a little bit more in key and in tune, which is super cool. In addition to that, we are playing with the decay at the end of each one of these sounds to kind of add that swelling, and then every once in a while automating the transpose. So it's kind of adding that cool, like, let's see if you can see it here. It should happen. There we go. So it's increasing the pitch and then dropping the pitch back down. So instead of playing with the actual MIDI file, using interesting effects to create that pitch effect and kind of changing the key and all that, and the chord progression following that. In terms of other processing, we have an auto filter here, set up with an LFO, which I can't seem to figure out where that LFO is. Oh no, sorry, no. This is actually doing the MIDI or the automation. So using an automation lane to also use the filter to kind of create that swelling effect as well. So quite a few different things being automated here on the track to create that kind of interesting swelling sound. Same thing is happening here in the EQ8. What we have is the lows being removed to make room for the subs, and then also adjusting the high shelf to also kind of create that swelling sound. In addition to that, we also have the one knob transient shaper here, and we are removing some of the sustain to tighten up the sound a little bit. Then we are going into the one knob sidechain to duck it from the kick, as well as this one knob saturation to add some fullness. And then last but not least, or almost last but not least, using this cool sound noise pan man to kind of move that sound across the left and right panorama to make things a little bit more interesting and keep things out of the middle, as well as using this one knob width to push things to the left and right even more to make room for everything in the middle. And then last but not least, we have this. Cool. So this is a very similar sound. It's doing the same MIDI as the previous track that we were just looking at. In terms of the sound design, we have a sound from MIA's Paper Airplanes. That guitar in the original tune is dropped it into Synth, tried to recreate it. It's always a lot more different than the original source file, which is why then it's running into the spectral resonator, again tracking from the subs, and it's doing very similar stuff to what we had before. So it's automating the transposition to kind of add that cool slowly pitching kind of sound like that, and changing the tune of it, and then dropping it back down. In addition to that, running it into a pitch shifter, pushing it up an octave, and then dropping the dry wet a little bit so it's kind of blending between the two. And then also removing a bunch of the lows, as you can see here, to make room for the subs. Transient designing, removing some of the sustain to tighten up the sound a little bit. Sidechain, one knob sidechain, bounce it against the kick. And then also adding in this gate and making the gate tracking from that organ sound to kind of tighten it up to that sound a little bit. And then another sound we have here is this pad. And so what this is we have to take a look at the MIDI. So it's F sharp, A sharp, and then halfway through a D sharp comes in. And if we listen to it in context, this is nowhere near in the original tune, but I liked it and I liked filling up the sound a bit. Using this UVI workstation thing, Noctua, just found an interesting pad. I don't think I changed too much of it, just like the sound of that pad. Then we're removing a bunch of the lows, a bunch of the highs. Using Portal as well. If I open up Portal, just found like a cool preset called Portal Clouds, kind of an interesting granular plugin that I like to use that makes things different. And then what I did was this kind of custom little audio rack. So I added an LFO and Portal together. And then this way, what I could do is very easily, we open up Portal, very easily adjust the dry and wet with an LFO. So things are kind of swelling in and out. Then what we have is this nice A1 trigger gate. It's completely free plugin if you want to check it out. But what's nice about it is it's kind of that stutter house sound. Very easy to create that cool stutter house sound. Then using a one knob sidechain to make room for the kick, and then using the one knob width for say the left and right to make room for the main sounds. And so for what I chose, I wanted to turn this into a remix of Paper Airplanes. So let me just bring it over here. Let me add in the vocals, and I'll explain what one did there. So, as you can hear, I decided to make this a remix of MIA's Paper Airplanes, and there's 2 vocal tracks. So what I did was to get the vocal by itself, I used a program called Lala.ai, and what I was able to do was just drop this track into that, and using AI, it separates out the vocals, so I was able to put the vocals in here. I had to do a bunch of like time warping, using Ableton's warp function to make sure it sounded like in time and wasn't all cranky and weird. And then I have 2 layers here. So first is this top layer. Very cool. So basically what's going on is I think the VIRJI sound here for vocals is more or less like pitching things up a little bit. So using complex warping, pitched up 3 semitones, and then kind of adding in bit crushing and distortion seems to more or less be the sound. So added in this erosion. I turn it off. It just adds kind of that crunch. Same thing with this overdrive. Pushes it forward, adds a bit of aggression to it. That's, I would say, the main thing. And then what we have is EQ8, removing some of the lows. Transit Designer, removing some of the sustain to tighten things up. For some of it, I'm bringing in the mix throughout the track to add that stutter sound. One knob sidechain, add that bounce. One knob drive, fill out one knob drive or saturation to kind of fill out the sound a bit, and then one knob width to push it to the side a little bit. Then I also have this additional layer. This one's pitched down 9 semitones using the texture algorithm, and then playing with the grain size a little bit. And this is like a very subtle thing, but it's just like that lower amount kind of fills things out. In terms of the processing, very similar processing. Erosion, no overdrive, moving a bunch of the lows, some of that trigger gate, one knob sidechain, saturation, width. Nothing too crazy. Yeah, and there we have it. Probably a lot less conventional than other tutorials, not fully trying to make it sound exactly like the tune, because one thing that I like to do here is recreate a track, get like inspired by it, but then slowly over time adjust things, make things different, so that way I could actually release this as an edit, or maybe replace these vocals so it's not an edit, put something new over top, and it's actually a song that can be released. It's not just a recreation that's just for the tubes. But yeah, hopefully you found this useful. Hi, my friend, Matt from Best Friends Club here. And if you've been paying attention to this super long video, then you've probably figured out what the 80-20 rule is when it comes to building out your songs. The goal here is to get 80% of the result with only 20% of the time, energy, and effort. And because the first key to the 80-20 rule here is to use a reference track, we're making sure that we're very easily hitting 80% of a high quality, professionally made song. In particular, we use that reference track to make sure that we're picking the right notes, sounds, and volumes as we're building out our song. The second key of the 80-20 rule here is to mix as you go in an extremely streamlined way by only focusing on the volume of each track, as well as using a simple repeatable channel strip for each track that we're adding to our songs. The third and final key is to repurpose your old project files and have a suite of powerful templates, Ableton racks, and one-knob effects that you've personalized and curated over time. If you'd like to get a head start by downloading all the racks, templates, and all the files that you've seen me use in the Ableton project file for this video, or if you'd just like to take a closer look at any of the techniques or tracks you saw me work on in this video at your own pace, you can find a link to this video's project files on screen now and at the second link that's in the YouTube description. I'm recreating a different song from the Beatport top charts every single week and making the project files available to anyone who wants them. You'll also get access to a private Discord where you can ask me and the community questions, as well as share tracks for feedback. If you or your music are not quite ready for a shot in the arm like that, I've also made you a completely free bundle of templates, samples, and special bonuses that have helped me figure out how to completely finish one new song each and every single week. And you can grab that free Ultimate Song Finishing Toolkit by visiting the first link that's in the YouTube description here. However, if you just feel like staying on YouTube for now, that's totally fine. Save that link for later and check out this playlist filled with videos just like the one you just watched, where I completely create songs inspired by tracks found in the Beatport top charts. Or if you really want to take what you've learned in this video to the next level, make sure you check out this video right here.